I had spent most of my life working hard, day in and day out, dreaming of the day I could finally sit back, relax, and enjoy the fruits of my labor. For over 40 years, I dedicated myself to my job in the small town of Yuma, Arizona, a place where everyone knew each other, and life moved at a steady, comforting pace. I was proud of the work I did, proud that I could support myself without ever asking for help, and most of all, proud that I was finally about to retire with a solid pension to see me through my golden years. That morning, I sat by the kitchen window, the Arizona sun casting a warm glow over the desert landscape, and thought about all the plans I had made. A little herb garden on the porch, visits with old friends I hadn't seen in years, maybe even a short trip to see my granddaughter in California. Retirement wasn't just an end, it was a beginning. A new chapter filled with hope and peace after decades of relentless work. I had always been cautious, saving every penny, watching every dollar, and trusting the system to protect what was rightfully mine. After all, isn't that what retirement was supposed to be? A safe harbor after a lifetime of toil? I felt secure, confident that my pension would be there, waiting for me when I finally stepped away from the daily grind. But then came the letter. It wasn't like any other letter I had received before. A crisp official envelope embossed with the seal of the pension fund administrators. At first, I thought it would be a simple notice about changes to my account or maybe an update on my benefits. Instead, those words hit me like a blow I never saw coming. My retirement funds had been frozen. Not just frozen, but seized without any clear explanation. I read the notice over and over, disbelief settling in like a cold winter chill. How could this be happening? After all these years, after every sacrifice, every sleepless night working overtime, this was the thanks I got? The letter was vague, filled with bureaucratic jargon that offered no clarity. It spoke of investigations and compliance issues, but gave no details about what I was accused of or why my money was suddenly out of reach. That afternoon, I sat at the dining table, the letter spread out before me, hands trembling as I tried to make sense of it all. I felt a mix of shock, confusion, and a deep, aching hurt. It was as if the foundation of my future had been ripped away without warning. The retirement I had dreamed of, planned for, and counted on was suddenly slipping through my fingers like sand. I thought about the years when I had worked 2 jobs just to cover rent and bills, the times I skipped meals to save money for that future I was promised. I had never imagined that the system I trusted would turn its back on me. The loneliness of that moment was overwhelming. At 68 years old, with no warning and no answers, I was left to face an uncertain future alone. But as the initial shock wore off, a spark of determination ignited inside me. I realized I couldn't just sit back and accept this injustice. I refused to let my hard-earned retirement be stolen away by faceless bureaucrats or corporate greed. This wasn't just about me, it was about standing up for dignity and fairness, for every person who had ever been promised security, and then had it cruelly taken away. I decided right then that I would fight. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I had to try. The thought of surrendering to this faceless system made my blood boil. I could still remember the pride I felt on my last day at work, the quiet joy of handing over my keys and saying goodbye to colleagues who had become like family. I wasn't ready to give up on that joy, on the peaceful life I had earned. That evening I called my daughter Susan. She had always been my rock, the one I turned to when life threw its worst at me. I told her about the letter, my voice trembling but steady. She was furious, promising to help me navigate the maze of phone calls and paperwork that lay ahead. Together, we began the painstaking process of trying to get answers from the pension fund administrators, but every call seemed to lead to more frustration and dead ends. Days turned into weeks, and the silence from those in charge was deafening. Each morning I woke up hoping for a letter, a phone call, any sign that someone was working to fix this mistake. Instead, I found myself sinking deeper into a pit of uncertainty and fear. How long could I hold on without access to the money I had counted on? How many more nights would I lie awake, wondering if I would be forced to sell my home or move in with my daughter? But even in the darkest moments, I found strength in the memories of my past struggles. I remembered the first time I walked into that factory as a young woman, nervous but determined to make a life for myself. I recalled the pride I felt the day I bought my little house with my own savings. I thought about the friends I had made along the way, the community that had been my extended family. I wasn't ready to give up, not yet. That night, as the desert sky stretched wide and starry above my porch, I made a silent vow. I would uncover the truth behind this cruel seizure. I would demand justice not just for myself, but for every retiree who might one day find themselves in my place. The fight ahead seemed daunting, and the path uncertain, but I had lived long enough to know that sometimes, the only way forward was through the storm. So I began to gather every piece of paperwork I could find, my pension statements, letters from the fund, bank records. I reached out to old colleagues and friends, asking if anyone had heard of similar cases. Slowly, a picture started to form. This wasn't a simple error or isolated incident. Something bigger was happening, something that threatened the security of countless seniors like me. I felt a fire building inside me, a fierce resolve that no bureaucrat or corporation could extinguish. I wasn't just fighting for my money, I was fighting for respect, for the promise that a lifetime of work would be honored, not erased. The road ahead was long, and I knew there would be setbacks, but I was ready. Retirement was supposed to be my sanctuary, a peaceful chapter after years of sacrifice. And I was determined to take it back no matter the cost. For as long as I could remember, my life had been a series of sacrifices, each one made with the hope that it would lead to a stable future. I worked the midnight shift at the manufacturing plant when my children were young, missing birthdays and school plays so I could earn overtime. I took on second jobs, cleaned houses on weekends, and learned to stretch every dollar until it begged for mercy. But it was all worth it, I told myself, because I was building something solid, a retirement that would let me rest, finally. I often thought back to the early days when I first started with the company. Back then, the pension plan was a small, almost forgotten promise tucked away in the employee handbook. I remember the company representatives coming around, assuring us that if we stayed loyal, the pension would be there when we needed it most. It was a comforting thought, one that kept me going through long shifts and tough times. I believed in that promise with all my heart. Over the years, the pension fund grew, or so I was told. Statements arrived annually, each one a quiet reassurance that my future was secure. I never questioned the fine print or the complicated jargon. Why would I? I had been told to trust the system, and I did. I had no reason to doubt that my hard-earned money was safe, tucked away in some secure vault, waiting for me. But now, as I dug deeper into the situation, I realized how little I truly knew. The pension fund was not just a simple savings account. It was managed by a web of bureaucratic entities and corporate interests, each with their own agenda. I discovered that the fund's administrators were often shielded from public scrutiny, operating behind closed doors with little accountability. It was a stark contrast to the transparency I had expected. I found myself reaching out to former colleagues, many of whom had retired years ago. Their stories were eerily similar: confusion, frustration, and a growing mistrust of the institutions that were supposed to protect them. Some had already had their benefits reduced or delayed without clear explanation. Others spoke of endless phone calls, lost paperwork, and a sense of helplessness that gnawed at their dignity. One afternoon, I met with Martha, a woman who had worked alongside me for nearly 3 decades. Over cups of bitter coffee in a quiet diner, she shared her own struggles. "They keep changing the rules," she said, her voice low but firm. "What was promised to us when we started isn't what we're getting now. And when you try to ask questions, they just stonewall you." Her words echoed my own experience, and I realized this wasn't just my fight. It was a battle facing countless others who had devoted their lives to honest work, only to be met with broken promises. The pension fund wasn't just mismanaged. It was part of a system that seemed designed to confuse and exploit those who depended on it. I also uncovered stories of trusted financial advisors who had been involved in managing the pension portfolios. Some had encouraged investments in risky ventures that seemed to prioritize corporate profits over retirees' security. I could still hear the reassuring voice of one advisor who had visited our plant years ago, promising that the fund was in good hands. Now that reassurance felt like a cruel joke. The more I learned, the more tangled the web became. The pension fund was tied to a complex network of investments, some of which had performed poorly or been diverted to cover corporate debts. Officials spoke in terms of market fluctuations and restructuring, but for us retirees, those were just empty words that translated to lost income and shattered futures. I spent hours poring over documents that were often dense and impenetrable. Legal disclaimers, policy changes, and fine print that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. It was clear that transparency was not a priority for those in charge. Instead, it felt like a game of smoke and mirrors, where the truth was hidden behind layers of bureaucracy. Despite this, I refused to be intimidated. I began attending local community meetings where other retirees shared their stories and frustrations. We formed a small network, supporting each other and pooling our knowledge. It was empowering to realize that I was not alone, that this was a systemic issue affecting many people who had given their all to their work in communities. One of the most painful realizations was how those who were supposed to be advocates, union representatives, pension board members, often seemed distant or complicit. Some had once been trusted allies, but now appeared resigned or unwilling to challenge the powerful interests behind the fund's management. It was a betrayal that cut deep. Still, I held on to the memories of better days, of the camaraderie between workers who believed in fairness and mutual respect. Those values felt under threat, but they also fueled my determination. If the system was broken, then it was up to us to demand change. I reached out to a few attorneys who specialized in pension law. Their initial assessments were sobering. The web of regulations and corporate protections made legal battles difficult, and many retirees lacked the resources to fight. But they also saw the potential for class action suits and public pressure to shine a light on the abuses. With Susan's help, I began documenting everything. Every phone call, letter, and conversation. I gathered testimonies from others who had been caught in the same nightmare. It was painstaking work but necessary. I couldn't rely on the kindness of strangers or the goodwill of corporations. I had to build a case brick by brick. There were days when the weight of it all threatened to crush me. The financial uncertainty, the broken promises, the sheer scale of the fight ahead. But then I remembered why I had started this journey. Not just for myself but for all the hardworking men and women who deserved better. The pension was more than money. It was a symbol of respect for a lifetime of effort. When that respect was stripped away, it was a wound that went far beyond finances. It was personal and it was wrong. With each passing day, I became more convinced that this was not just a personal battle but a fight for justice. The system had failed us, but we were not powerless. If we could expose the truth, hold those responsible accountable, maybe we could protect the next generation from the same fate. So I kept digging, kept asking questions, and kept pushing forward, even when the answers were hard to hear. Because hope, I realized, was not just a feeling, it was a choice. And I was choosing to fight. As I dived deeper into the tangled mess of documents and testimonies, the reality of what had happened to my retirement funds began to crystallize into something much darker than I had imagined. This was no simple administrative error, or an unfortunate downturn in the market. It was a deliberate and systemic mismanagement that had been happening for years, quietly siphoning off the hard-earned savings of countless seniors like me. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by piles of paperwork, I uncovered a series of internal reports that were never meant for public eyes. These documents revealed that a significant portion of the pension fund's assets had been diverted into risky investments, ventures that lined the pockets of corporate executives, rather than securing retiree futures. I could barely hold back tears as I read through the cold, calculated language describing the billions lost or redirected. It was a betrayal on an unimaginable scale. The very people entrusted with protecting our pensions had instead treated them as a source of quick profit, gambling away the security of generations. And worse, when those investments failed, the burden was passed down to us, the retirees who had nothing left but hope and a promise. But I wasn't alone in this fight. As I connected with others affected by the freeze, a clearer picture began to emerge. This wasn't just about me or my small town in Arizona. It was part of a larger nationwide pattern of pension fund exploitation. Stories poured in from across the country. Retirees who had suddenly found their payments delayed or cut, families forced to tighten their belts as promised incomes vanished. I gathered these voices, these stories of heartbreak and betrayal, into a growing dossier. There was Martha, who had to move in with her daughter after her pension check stopped. Harold, a former teacher whose medical bills piled up without his benefits, and countless others, each story a testament to the human cost behind the numbers. The emotional toll was staggering. Many of us had planned our golden years around these pensions. Some had already downsized their homes, given up careers, or made difficult sacrifices in anticipation of a stable income. Now we faced the harsh reality that those plans were unraveling before our eyes. Financially, the strain was unbearable. Without access to my funds, I had to dip into savings meant for emergencies, cutting back on groceries and postponing medical appointments. The stress gnawed at me, sometimes keeping me awake through the long Arizona nights. But it also fueled my resolve. I couldn't let this injustice continue unchecked. I started reaching out to whistleblowers, former employees of the pension fund who had grown disillusioned and wanted the truth to come out. Their courage amazed me. They shared emails, internal memos, and testimony that exposed the culture of secrecy and greed that had taken root within the organization. It was a world where profits were prioritized over people, and where accountability was deliberately avoided. One such whistleblower, a quiet man named James, gave me access to financial records that showed how fund managers had deliberately concealed losses and manipulated reports to hide the true state of affairs. His voice was steady but filled with sorrow as he explained how he had tried to raise concerns, only to be silenced or ignored. Collecting this evidence was both empowering and exhausting. Each new document, each new story was a hammer blow to the facade of trust the pension fund had built. But it also meant I was wading into dangerous territory. I received vague threats, cold shoulders from officials, and a growing sense that powerful people wanted this covered up. Despite the obstacles, I pressed on, determined to shine a light on the corruption. I knew that exposing the truth was the first step toward justice. With Susan's help, we compiled everything into a comprehensive file, ready to be shared with legal experts and the media. The emotional turmoil was immense. I felt the weight of not only my own loss but the collective pain of a community betrayed. Yet there was a strange comfort in knowing I was no longer alone in this fight. We were many, and our voices were beginning to rise. Each day brought new challenges. Calls from pension administrators became more hostile. Letters from lawyers warned me to cease and desist. But I refused to be intimidated. This was bigger than me, bigger than fear. I also found strength in unexpected places. Local reporters took interest in the story, eager to uncover the scandal. Community groups rallied around us, organizing meetings and support networks. What had started as a solitary struggle was growing into a movement. Still, the financial strain was harsh. I had to be careful with every dollar, balancing the costs of legal advice, travel to hearings, and basic living expenses. But I reminded myself that this fight was necessary, not just for me, but for the dignity of every retiree who deserved better. As I pieced together the full scope of the mismanagement, it became clear that this was no accident. The pattern of deception, manipulation, and outright theft was systematic, woven into the very fabric of the pension fund's operations. The betrayal was calculated and cold, targeting the most vulnerable under the guise of bureaucratic complexity. I thought about the promises made to me when I was young, the assurance that hard work would be rewarded with security and peace. Those promises had been broken, but I refused to let that be the final chapter. With evidence in hand and a growing coalition behind me, I knew the battle was just beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but the truth was finally coming to light. For the first time since my pension was seized, I felt a flicker of hope. The fight was no longer just about reclaiming my money. It was about exposing a corrupt system and demanding accountability. And I was ready to face whatever came next. The day of the public hearing arrived with a weight that settled deep in my chest. Months of gathering evidence, rallying support, and preparing my voice had brought me here, facing the very officials and corporate representatives responsible for the devastation of my retirement and that of so many others. As I entered the packed auditorium, I could feel the eyes of the community on me, a mix of hope and expectation hanging in the air. The room buzzed with tension. Rows of retirees, advocates, and journalists filled the seats, while at the front sat a panel of stern-faced executives and bureaucrats, their expressions carefully neutral. Behind them, a banner bore the insignia of the pension fund, a stark reminder of the institution I was challenging. When my name was called, I took a deep breath and stepped to the microphone, clutching the stack of documents I had brought as proof. The silence was profound, every ear focused on the words I was about to speak. I began by telling my story, the years of sacrifice, the dreams of retirement shattered overnight by a cold and unexplained freeze on my pension. I spoke of the countless others whose lives had been upended, their voices silenced by bureaucratic indifference and corporate greed. With each word I laid out the evidence we had uncovered, the mismanagement, the risky investments, the deliberate concealment of losses. The room was still as I presented internal emails and financial reports, showing how the fund's managers had prioritized profit over people. I described the pattern of deception and the human costs behind the numbers. Faces in the crowd nodded in recognition. Some wiped away tears. Then came the moment of confrontation. I addressed the panel directly, demanding answers for the broken promises and the stolen security. I challenged their narrative of market fluctuations and unforeseen circumstances, exposing it as a smokescreen for their failures and misconduct. The atmosphere grew charged. The executives responded with rehearsed statements, blaming economic downturns and external factors beyond their control. But their words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence I had laid before them. Journalists in the room began taking notes furiously, their cameras capturing every exchange. It was clear this hearing was no longer a simple formality. The truth was breaking through the carefully constructed facade. As I spoke, I could feel the energy shift. The retirees in the audience found their voice, standing to share their own stories of hardship and betrayal. Their collective testimony became a chorus of outrage and determination. What had started as a personal fight had transformed into a powerful movement demanding justice. The panel tried to regain control, but the tide had turned. Questions from the community grew sharper, and the pressure mounted. Officials who once seemed untouchable were now on the defensive, their attempts to deflect and deny unraveling under scrutiny. Throughout the hearing I remained steady, even as emotions surged within me. I thought of the nights spent worrying about bills, the friendships strained by uncertainty, and the dreams deferred. But I also thought of the strength I had found in this fight, the solidarity of those who refused to be silenced. By the end of the day, it was clear that change was inevitable. The media coverage exploded, bringing national attention to the scandal. Public outrage forced lawmakers to take notice, and investigations were launched into the pension fund's practices. The hearing marked a turning point not just for me but for all who had been wronged. It was a victory born from courage and relentless pursuit of truth. Yet, I knew the battle was far from over. Legal proceedings loomed, and the path to full justice would be long and arduous. But the foundation had been laid, and the voices of the people could no longer be ignored. As I left the auditorium that evening, surrounded by supporters and reporters, I felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. The fight had taken a toll, but it had also awakened a power within me I never knew I had. I was no longer just a retiree fighting for her pension. I was a symbol of resilience and determination, a beacon for others facing similar battles. And as the sun set over the Arizona desert, I promised myself I would see this through, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. I never imagined that my fight to reclaim my retirement would lead me here, standing at the forefront of a movement that was reshaping the very laws meant to protect us. After the public hearing, the momentum only grew stronger. With the evidence we had uncovered and the stories we shared, lawmakers couldn't turn a blind eye any longer. New regulations were drafted, designed to bring transparency and accountability to pension funds across Arizona and beyond. I found myself invited to speak at community forums and legislative sessions, my voice no longer just my own, but carrying the hopes of thousands who had suffered in silence. At first, the attention was overwhelming. I was just a woman from a small town, not a politician or an activist. But I had learned that courage often comes from the most unexpected places, and that one person's determination can spark change. The reforms that followed were hard-won. They included stricter oversight of pension fund investments, mandatory disclosures of financial dealings, and protections to ensure retirees could not be left in the dark about their benefits. Laws were passed to prevent the kind of risky gambles that had put so many of us in jeopardy. It was a victory not just for me, but for retirees everywhere who depended on those promises for their dignity and survival. Locally, the community rallied around me in ways I could never have anticipated. Neighbors I had barely spoken to before stopped by with words of encouragement, meals, and even offers to help with paperwork. The support was humbling and reminded me that our strength lies in solidarity. I wasn't alone. We were a community bound by shared struggle and newfound hope. Media outlets that had once been skeptical now portrayed me as a symbol of resilience and justice. Interviews, profiles, and stories highlighted not just the scandal, but the power of ordinary people rising up against injustice. I was proud but also deeply aware that this was about more than recognition. It was about ensuring no one else would have to endure what we had. With the legal battles finally concluding in our favor, my pension was restored, along with compensation for the losses we had suffered. The relief was profound, but it was the restoration of trust and dignity that meant the most. I could finally breathe again, knowing that the promise made to me decades ago was honored. In the months that followed, I settled into a retirement that felt truly mine. A time of peace, surrounded by friends and family who had stood by me. I spent mornings tending to my herb garden, afternoons visiting with Susan and my granddaughter, and evenings watching the desert sunset, feeling a profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. But even as I enjoyed this new chapter, I stayed connected to the cause. I worked with advocacy groups to educate others about their rights and the importance of vigilance. My story became a beacon, a reminder that justice is possible when we refuse to be silent. Looking back, I see a path marked by hardship, courage, and ultimately triumph. The battle for my retirement was never just about money. It was about standing up for what is right, demanding respect, and protecting the future for all who come after. As I sit on my porch, the warm Arizona breeze carrying the scent of my garden, I feel a quiet pride. I fought not just for myself, but for every retiree who deserves to live their golden years with security and dignity. And in that fight I found a family. Not just of blood, but of shared strength and unbreakable spirit. This victory belongs to all of us.